Have you ever walked into a room and felt the energy shift, knowing somehow that you were the topic of conversation just moments before? Have you ever trusted someone so completely that when they betrayed you, it felt like the ground beneath your feet had simply disappeared? This is Sarah's story, and if you've ever felt the sting of workplace manipulation, the crushing weight of false accusations, or the suffocating grip of someone else's need to control your life, then perhaps this story will feel like it was written just for you. Sarah Michelle Patterson was 37 years old when her world began to unravel, not through any catastrophic event or sudden tragedy, but through the slow, methodical erosion of everything she had worked so hard to build. Living in Portland, Oregon, Sarah had climbed the corporate ladder at Henderson Financial Group with determination, grace, and an unwavering belief that hard work and integrity would always triumph over politics and manipulation. For 12 years, Sarah had been the steady heartbeat of the client relations department, the person everyone turned to when complex problems needed elegant solutions. She had built her reputation on being the bridge between demanding clients and overwhelmed colleagues, the voice of calm in the storm of quarterly pressures and deadline chaos. Her corner office on the 15th floor wasn't just a testament to her success. It was her sanctuary, filled with plants that somehow thrived under fluorescent lights, photographs of her daughter Emma at various school events, and awards that spoke to a career built on genuine care for both clients and colleagues. Sarah believed in people, trusted in the fundamental goodness that she was certain lived within everyone if you just looked hard enough. And this belief had served her well until the day Rachel Morrison walked through the doors of Henderson Financial. Rachel was everything Sarah had never been. Sharp angles where Sarah was soft curves, calculated coldness where Sarah offered warmth, and an ambition that seemed to burn with an intensity that made everyone around her step back just a little. At 29, Rachel had graduated from an Ivy League business school with honors and a network of connections that stretched from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Her resume read like a roadmap to success, each position carefully chosen not for passion or purpose, but for the strategic advantage it would provide in her relentless climb to the top. When she was hired as the new director of strategic initiatives, a position that had been created specifically for her impressive credentials, Sarah welcomed her with the same open warmth she extended to everyone who joined their team. The first few months were a honeymoon period of sorts. Rachel shadowed Sarah during client meetings, absorbing not just the technical aspects of their work, but the subtle art of relationship building that had made Sarah so successful. She listened intently as Sarah explained the delicate balance of managing client expectations while advocating for realistic timelines, the importance of understanding each client's unique communication style, and the value of building trust through consistent follow-through on even the smallest promises. Rachel's notebook was always open, her pen constantly moving, and her questions were sharp and insightful. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Rachel's quick grasp of complex concepts and her apparent enthusiasm for learning the nuances of their department's approach to client management. But there were small moments, tiny cracks in Rachel's carefully constructed facade that Sarah chose to overlook in her characteristic desire to see the best in everyone. The way Rachel's smile never quite reached her eyes when clients praised Sarah's work in front of her. The subtle way she would redirect conversations during team meetings to highlight her own contributions while minimizing others. The careful manner in which she began to position herself as the fresh perspective that Henderson Financial needed to modernize their approach. These moments were so subtle, so expertly woven into otherwise normal interactions that Sarah dismissed them as the natural adjustment period of someone new trying to find their place in an established team. The shift began so gradually that Sarah didn't recognize it as a shift at all. Rachel started staying late more often, volunteering for additional projects, and finding reasons to schedule one-on-one meetings with their boss, Michael Chen. She began CCing Michael on emails that previously would have been simple exchanges between colleagues, always with a brief note about wanting to ensure transparency and keep leadership informed. When Sarah mentioned that some of their longtime clients had expressed confusion about receiving communications from multiple team members on the same project, Rachel was quick to suggest that perhaps they needed better protocols for client communication. She volunteered to draft a proposal for streamlining their processes, a document that somehow managed to position Rachel as the central coordinator for all major client relationships. The proposal landed on Michael's desk on a Tuesday morning in October, professionally bound and comprehensive in its analysis of what Rachel termed inefficiencies in current client management protocols. Sarah learned about it during their weekly team meeting, when Michael mentioned how impressed he was with Rachel's initiative in identifying areas for improvement. As he outlined the key recommendations from Rachel's report, Sarah felt a familiar sensation that she couldn't quite name. It was the feeling of watching someone else receive credit for ideas she had shared in casual conversations, seeing her own methods and strategies repackaged as innovative solutions discovered by someone else. But when she tried to speak up, to clarify that many of these new protocols had been part of their standard practice for years, her words seemed to fall flat against Rachel's confident presentation of data and metrics that somehow painted the existing system as outdated and ineffective. The gaslighting began in earnest after that meeting. When Sarah mentioned to Rachel that she was surprised to see some of their established practices characterized as problems in the report, Rachel's response was a masterclass in manipulation wrapped in concern. "Oh, Sarah, I think there might be some confusion here. I wasn't criticizing the work you've done. It's been wonderful for its time. I was just thinking about how we could evolve our approach to meet the changing expectations of our clients." The words were delivered with a smile and a tone that suggested gentle guidance rather than confrontation, but they carried a sting that Sarah felt long after the conversation ended. It was the phrase, "for its time," that lingered, with its implication that Sarah's methods, and by extension Sarah herself, were somehow becoming obsolete. Rachel's strategy was insidious in its subtlety. She never directly contradicted Sarah in group settings, never raised her voice, never did anything that could be construed as openly hostile. Instead, she wielded doubt like a surgeon's scalpel, making precise cuts that were barely visible but profoundly damaging. In client meetings, she would ask seemingly innocent questions that highlighted potential problems with approaches that Sarah recommended. "I'm wondering if we've considered how this strategy might be perceived by their board of directors," she would say. Or, "Have we thought about what happens if the market shifts before this implementation is complete?" These questions weren't inherently problematic. They were actually quite good questions. But they had the effect of casting Sarah's recommendations in a shadow of uncertainty, while positioning Rachel as the voice of prudent caution. The clients began to notice the dynamic shift before Sarah fully understood what was happening to her. Margaret Whitfield, the CEO of one of their oldest accounts, pulled Sarah aside after a particularly tense project review meeting. "Sarah, honey, I have to ask, is everything okay with your team? I've been working with you for 8 years, and I've never seen you second-guess yourself the way you did in there today." Margaret's concern was genuine and maternal, the kind of caring feedback that comes from a relationship built on mutual respect and trust. But Sarah found herself unable to articulate what she was experiencing because she didn't fully understand it herself. How do you explain that you're drowning in quicksand that no one else can see? How do you describe the suffocating sensation of having your expertise slowly eroded by someone who smiles while they undermine you? The psychological warfare escalated as Rachel grew bolder in her manipulations. She began scheduling impromptu meetings with Sarah's key clients, always with a reasonable excuse, following up on questions that arose after regular meetings, providing additional research that she thought might be helpful, offering to serve as a backup contact for urgent issues. These meetings were never quite long enough or substantial enough for Sarah to object to them, but they served Rachel's purposes perfectly. She used them to plant seeds of doubt about Sarah's judgment, always couched in language of concern and collaboration. "Sarah is such a dedicated professional, but I worry that she might be stretched a little thin with her current workload. I want to make sure you're getting the level of attention you deserve." The brilliance of this approach was that it appeared to support Sarah while actually undermining her, creating a narrative that she was overwhelmed, unfocused, or perhaps losing her edge. Sarah's home life began to suffer, as the stress of navigating this toxic dynamic consumed more of her emotional energy. Her daughter Emma, now 16 and perceptive in the way that teenagers can be when their parents' usual steadiness begins to crack, started asking questions that Sarah struggled to answer. "Mom, why do you seem so tired all the time? Why do you check your phone so much during dinner? Why did I hear you crying in the shower yesterday?" Each question was a small knife twist, not because Emma was being unkind, but because they forced Sarah to confront the extent to which her workplace situation was bleeding into every aspect of her life. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying conversations and analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings, trying to figure out what she had done wrong and how she could fix a problem she couldn't even properly define. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Rachel's campaign. Sarah's colleagues, who had once been allies and friends, began to distance themselves as they witnessed the shifting power dynamic. It wasn't that they actively chose to side against Sarah, but rather that they recognized the political winds were changing and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The lunch invitations became less frequent, the casual conversations in the hallway grew shorter, and the collaborative problem-solving sessions that had once been the heartbeat of their department became formal meetings where Sarah increasingly found herself defending decisions that had never been questioned before. The message was clear even if it was never spoken. Sarah's star was falling, and Rachel's was rising, and no one wanted to be too closely associated with the former when the latter held the promise of future advancement. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when Sarah arrived at the office to find her keycard access had been temporarily suspended pending a review of an alleged security violation. The violation was minor. Supposedly she had shared client information via an unsecured email channel, but it was enough to justify removing her from active client contact while the investigation was conducted. Rachel, of course, was more than willing to step in and handle Sarah's accounts during this difficult time. "I know how hard this must be for you, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Please don't worry about anything. I'll make sure all of your clients are taken care of while this gets sorted out. You just focus on getting through this process." The hug she offered felt like a predator marking her territory, claiming ownership of everything Sarah had built while pretending to offer comfort and support. The investigation that followed was a Kafkaesque nightmare of bureaucratic procedures and loaded questions. Sarah was required to attend multiple meetings with human resources, each one focused on examining her recent performance and exploring whether there were systemic issues with her approach to client management that might have contributed to the security breach. The evidence against her was circumstantial and weak, a forwarded email that technically violated protocol but was the kind of minor infraction that happened hundreds of times each day throughout the company. Under normal circumstances, it would have warranted nothing more than a gentle reminder about proper procedures. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Sarah was beginning to understand that this investigation wasn't really about a security violation at all. Rachel's fingerprints were nowhere to be found on the investigation, but her influence was everywhere. The questions Sarah faced in her meetings seemed designed to elicit admissions of stress, overwhelm, or professional uncertainty. "Have you been feeling adequate support in managing your workload recently?" they asked. "Have you noticed any changes in your attention to detail or your ability to maintain our standard protocols?" Each question felt like a trap, designed to create a record of Sarah acknowledging problems that could later be used to justify whatever action they had already decided to take. When Sarah tried to defend herself, to explain the context behind the email in question, or to highlight her years of exemplary performance, she was met with sympathetic nods and gentle suggestions that perhaps she was being a bit defensive, which might itself indicate that the stress was affecting her more than she realized. Meanwhile, Rachel was working overtime to cement her position as Sarah's successor. She scheduled individual meetings with each of Sarah's clients, ostensibly to ensure continuity of service, but actually to begin the process of transferring their loyalty and trust to herself. Her approach was subtle but effective. She listened carefully to their concerns, acknowledged the disruption caused by the transition, and positioned herself as the stable, reliable alternative who could provide the kind of innovative thinking that their business needed to thrive in a rapidly changing marketplace. Within weeks, clients who had worked exclusively with Sarah for years were praising Rachel's fresh perspective and strategic insights, never realizing that they were essentially applauding their own feedback repackaged and delivered back to them with a bow on top. The final blow came in the form of a restructuring announcement that Michael delivered with apologetic regret but unmistakable finality. The security investigation had revealed what he characterized as systemic communication challenges that required a comprehensive review of their client management protocols. In the interest of maintaining client confidence and ensuring the highest standards of service, they had decided to implement a new organizational structure that would better align their resources with their strategic objectives. Sarah's position was being eliminated, and while they would certainly provide her with a generous severance package and excellent references, they felt it was in everyone's best interest to make a clean transition to the new model. Rachel would be assuming responsibility for the client relationships, effective immediately, bringing her innovative approach to the expanded role of Senior Director of Client Strategy. Sarah sat in that meeting feeling as though she was watching her professional execution from somewhere outside her own body. The language was corporate and clinical, focused on organizational needs and strategic alignment, but the reality was brutally personal. She was being discarded and replaced by someone who had systematically dismantled her reputation and stolen her life's work. When Michael asked if she had any questions, Sarah found herself unable to speak, not because she didn't have questions, but because she finally understood that there were no answers that would change anything. This had never been about a security violation or communication challenges or strategic restructuring. This had been about power and ambition and the calculated destruction of someone who stood in the way of what Rachel Morrison wanted. The weeks that followed her termination were a strange mixture of grief and clarity. Sarah found herself cycling through the familiar stages of loss, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, but with the added complexity of trying to process a betrayal so comprehensive that it felt like a violation of everything she had believed about human nature. Friends and family offered comfort and advice, most of it well-meaning but ultimately hollow. "You're better off without them," they said, or "This is just an opportunity for something better to come along," or "At least now you know who Rachel really is." But none of these platitudes addressed the deeper wound that Sarah was struggling to heal, the fundamental damage to her ability to trust her own judgment and believe in the goodness of others. Emma became Sarah's anchor during this dark period, offering the kind of uncomplicated love and support that only a child can provide to a parent in crisis. She didn't try to fix the situation or offer solutions. She simply stayed close, bringing her mother cups of tea and sitting quietly beside her during the long afternoons when Sarah couldn't summon the energy to do anything but stare out the window and try to make sense of what had happened to her life. "Mom," Emma said one evening as they sat together on the couch, "I don't understand everything that happened at your job, but I know it wasn't your fault. You're the strongest, kindest, most honest person I know, and whoever did this to you is going to have to live with what they did for the rest of their lives. But you get to decide what you do next, and I know whatever you choose will be amazing because you're amazing." Those words from her daughter became a turning point for Sarah, not because they magically healed her wounds or erased the trauma of her experience, but because they reminded her of something she had temporarily lost sight of in the chaos of the preceding months. She was not defined by what had been done to her, but by how she chose to respond to it. The person Rachel had tried to convince everyone that Sarah was overwhelmed, outdated, unreliable, was not the person Sarah actually was. That person was a creation of Rachel's ambition and manipulation, a necessary fiction that served Rachel's purposes but had no basis in reality. The real Sarah was still there, wounded but not broken, betrayed but not destroyed, and capable of writing the next chapter of her story on her own terms. The healing process was not linear or simple, but it was profoundly transformative. Sarah began working with a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma and narcissistic abuse, learning to recognize the patterns of manipulation she had endured and developing strategies for protecting herself from similar situations in the future. She discovered that what she had experienced had a name: workplace mobbing, and that she was far from alone in having endured this kind of systematic destruction. There were support groups and online communities filled with people who had lived through similar experiences, and while their stories were heartbreaking, they were also validating in a way that Sarah hadn't expected. For the first time in months, she didn't feel crazy or weak or somehow responsible for her own destruction. 6 months after her termination, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She decided to start her own consulting practice. The idea had been percolating in the back of her mind as she processed her experience and began to understand that the skills and knowledge that Rachel had tried so hard to claim as her own were actually Sarah's unique gifts. Gifts that no one could take away from her, no matter how they might try to discredit or devalue them. Sarah's approach to client relations wasn't outdated or ineffective. It was built on genuine human connection and authentic relationship building, qualities that were becoming increasingly rare and therefore increasingly valuable in a business world dominated by metrics and algorithms. The process of building her own business was challenging in ways that Sarah hadn't anticipated, but it was also deeply healing. Every client she gained, every problem she solved, every relationship she built was evidence that her professional abilities were real and valuable, not the outdated artifacts of a bygone era that Rachel had tried to convince everyone they were. More importantly, running her own business meant that she would never again be vulnerable to the kind of systematic manipulation and power play that had destroyed her position at Henderson Financial. She was in control of her own destiny now, answerable only to her clients and her own standards of excellence. News from her former workplace filtered back to Sarah through former colleagues who had maintained contact despite the awkwardness of the circumstances surrounding her departure. The reports painted a picture that was both satisfying and sad. Rachel's reign as senior director of client strategy was not going as smoothly as anyone had hoped. Without Sarah's steady influence and relationship-building expertise, several long-term clients had become increasingly dissatisfied with the service they were receiving. Rachel's innovative strategies looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations, but proved difficult to implement effectively. And her communication style, while polished and professional, lacked the warmth and authenticity that clients had come to expect from their interactions with Henderson Financial. Margaret Whitfield was among the first to express serious concerns about the new direction of their account management. She had tried to give Rachel the benefit of the doubt, understanding that transitions could be difficult and that new people needed time to develop their own rhythm with existing clients. But after several months of interactions that felt increasingly transactional and impersonal, Margaret found herself missing the genuine partnership she had enjoyed with Sarah. When she learned through mutual connections that Sarah had started her own practice, Margaret didn't hesitate to reach out. The conversation that followed was both professional and deeply personal, as Margaret expressed not just her interest in working with Sarah again, but her regret over the circumstances that had led to their separation. Within a year of starting her practice, Sarah had successfully transitioned several of her former clients to her new business, along with attracting new accounts through referrals and networking. The irony was not lost on her that Rachel's attempts to steal her life's work had actually forced Sarah to discover her own entrepreneurial potential and create something far more valuable than the corporate position she had lost. The consulting practice allowed her to work on her own terms, with clients who valued her expertise and approach, free from the politics and manipulation that had made her final years at Henderson Financial so miserable. She was earning more money than she ever had as an employee, but more importantly, she was rediscovering the joy and satisfaction that had originally drawn her to client relations work. The most unexpected aspect of Sarah's recovery was how the experience had changed her relationship with trust and human nature. Rather than making her cynical or closed off, surviving Rachel's betrayal had actually deepened her appreciation for authentic relationships and honest communication. She had learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and narcissistic behavior, but she had also learned to distinguish between appropriate caution and paralyzing fear. The people who surrounded her now, her clients, her professional network, her friends and family, were there because they chose to be, not because of proximity or convenience or political advantage. The relationships were cleaner, more genuine, and ultimately more fulfilling than many of the connections she had maintained during her corporate years. Emma, now a junior in high school, had watched her mother's transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. The stressed, anxious woman who had come home from Henderson Financial each day, carrying the weight of Rachel's psychological warfare, had been replaced by someone who was calmer, more confident, and genuinely excited about her work again. "Mom," Emma said one evening as they prepared dinner together, "I'm really glad that awful thing happened to you." Sarah looked at her daughter with surprise and asked what she meant. "I mean, I'm not glad that woman was so horrible to you, and I'm not glad that you went through all that pain, but I'm glad it led you to where you are now, because this version of you is so much happier than the old version. It's like you had to lose everything you thought you wanted to find out who you really are." As Sarah's second year as an independent consultant drew to a close, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had sat in Michael Chen's office 18 months earlier, listening to corporate speak about restructuring and strategic alignment, while her professional life crumbled around her, felt like a different person. Not because the fundamental aspects of her character had changed, but because she had been forced to discover reserves of strength and resilience that she hadn't known she possessed. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating in ways she could never have anticipated. She no longer defined her worth by other people's approval or measured her success by her ability to navigate office politics. She had learned to trust herself again, to value her own judgment, and to create boundaries that protected her from the kind of systematic manipulation that had nearly destroyed her. The final validation came in an unexpected form. A call from Michael Chen, her former boss at Henderson Financial. The conversation was awkward and stilted, filled with corporate euphemisms and careful language that couldn't quite disguise the fact that he was essentially admitting they had made a terrible mistake. Rachel's tenure as senior director had been marked by significant client losses, internal conflicts, and a gradual erosion of the department's reputation within the company. Several key employees had left, citing concerns about the toxic work environment and lack of leadership support. The restructuring that was supposed to have modernized their approach had instead created chaos and confusion, with no clear benefits to offset the substantial costs. Michael was calling to see if Sarah might be interested in returning to Henderson Financial in a senior consulting role with significant autonomy and compensation that reflected their recognition of her value. Sarah listened to Michael's pitch with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. The offer was generous and might have been appealing 2 years earlier, but the woman she had become was no longer interested in returning to a system that had allowed her to be systematically destroyed for the convenience of someone else's ambition. She declined politely but firmly, explaining that she had built something valuable and meaningful with her consulting practice and had no desire to return to corporate employment. The conversation ended cordially, but Sarah couldn't help smiling as she hung up the phone. Rachel Morrison's victory had been comprehensive but temporary. The long-term consequences of her actions had ultimately revealed the hollowness of her strategic thinking and the unsustainable nature of relationships built on manipulation rather than mutual respect. Today, Sarah runs a thriving consultancy that specializes in helping businesses build authentic relationships with their clients through ethical practices and genuine communication. Her approach, once dismissed by Rachel as outdated and ineffective, has proven to be exactly what many companies need in an era of increasing customer skepticism and corporate distrust. She speaks regularly at industry conferences about the importance of integrity in business relationships and has become something of an expert on workplace trauma and recovery. Her story has resonated with countless other professionals who have survived similar experiences, and she has used her platform to advocate for better protections against workplace bullying and more robust support systems for victims of professional manipulation. But perhaps the most important measure of Sarah's recovery is not professional success or financial stability, but the peace she has found with her own story. She no longer carries anger toward Rachel Morrison, not because she has forgotten what happened or minimized its impact, but because she has learned that carrying that anger only gives Rachel continued power over her life. The betrayal was real, the damage was significant, and the trauma took time to heal, but none of those things define Sarah's worth or determine her future. She has reclaimed her narrative from someone who tried to rewrite it for their own purposes, and in doing so, she has discovered a strength and authenticity that no one can take away from her. Emma is now a college freshman studying psychology, inspired in part by watching her mother navigate the complexities of trauma and recovery. She often tells friends about her mother's journey, not as a cautionary tale about workplace politics, but as a story about resilience and the possibility of transformation, even in the face of devastating betrayal. "My mom always says that the worst thing that happened to her turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to her," Emma explains. Not because it was easy or fun or because she deserved it, but because it forced her to discover who she really was underneath all the things she thought she was supposed to be. She's the strongest person I know, not because nothing bad ever happened to her, but because when something terrible did happen, she found a way to turn it into something beautiful. For those who have lived through similar experiences of workplace betrayal, systematic manipulation, or professional destruction, Sarah's story offers both validation and hope. The pain you feel is real, the confusion and self-doubt are normal responses to abnormal treatment, and the recovery process is possible even when it feels impossible. The people who choose to destroy others for their own advancement reveal far more about their own character than they ever reveal about their victims. Their victories may be immediate and visible, but they are ultimately hollow and unsustainable, built on foundations that will eventually crumble under the weight of their own deception. The most important lesson from Sarah's journey is not that justice always prevails, or that bad people always get their comeuppance, because those things are not always true. The most important lesson is that you are not defined by what others do to you, but by how you choose to respond to what they do. You cannot control the Rachel Morrisons of the world, cannot prevent them from trying to steal what you have built or destroy what you value. But you can control your own response to their actions, can choose to rebuild rather than remain broken, can decide to trust again rather than close your heart forever. The choice is always yours, even when it feels like you have no choices left. Sarah Patterson's story is ultimately a story about the indomitable strength of the human spirit when it is tested by betrayal and emerges not bitter but wiser, not closed but more discerning, not defeated but transformed. It is a reminder that sometimes the people who try to destroy us actually do us the greatest favor of our lives by forcing us to discover our own power and potential. The woman who walked out of Henderson Financial Group on that cold February day thought her professional life was over, but she was actually walking toward a future that was richer, more authentic, and more fulfilling than anything she had previously imagined possible. If you are facing your own Rachel Morrison, if you are caught in the quicksand of someone else's ambition and manipulation, if you feel like your professional life is being systematically destroyed by someone who smiles while they undermine you, please know that you are not alone. You are not crazy, and you are not powerless. The path forward may not be visible yet, the healing process may take longer than you want it to, and the outcome may look different than what you originally planned. But on the remember